So if your bag is meaty issues, I don't think it comes much meatier than this. I'm going to be talking about equality in quite a wide-ranging sense, talking about racism, who is racist, what does it mean to be racist, is that ever acceptable, talking about issues of sexual consent. Quite a wide-ranging thing here. And the reason I'm talking about these issues is that I, like quite a lot of people online, it's kind of interesting, this, is that we regard ourselves as socially progressive in many ways. And yet, a lot of the time we find ourselves arguing and berating other progressives, or the social progressives, which is an interesting thing. And it's almost become the kind of scenario, it reminds me in many ways of what happened in the United Kingdom back in the 70s, where the National Front, which was a kind of racist organisation, kind of took ownership in a way and became heavily associated with the Union Jack, our national flag, such that it was almost seen as a little bit racist to start flying our own national flag, which is a slightly objectionable state of affairs as far as I'm concerned. And so then I think it behooves normal people who would like to associate themselves with their national flag to take ownership of it again. And I see the same thing here, right? I happily regard myself as a progressive, and I kind of want to take ownership back of that again, and not simply leave that exclusively in the hands of those who take a much more hard line, a much more radical approach to their progressivism. So I'm responding to a question and to a video. And the title kind of sums it up, really, the point that I'm making here. 12 questions for progressives, then in brackets SJWs, in 2017, seemingly making the connection: if you're a progressive, you're an SJW. And indeed, as the guy who made the video, the Distributist, says, many times during his video, he talks about being exclusively being on the left. If you're a progressive, you're on the left, and this progressive movement, as if we're all kind of bunched in together. Of course, if you look at politics in the UK, I mean, I don't know the situation quite so well in the US, most people who are politically central would regard themselves as progressive, socially progressive, progressive on social issues, as would the vast majority of people, I would say, who are centre-right. I mean, even David Cameron, the previous Prime Minister, if you look on a lot of social issues such as gay marriage, he took the progressive stance, right? So it's simply not as clear-cut as socially progressive politics being a left-wing thing. And so I think we need to perhaps start trying to take ownership of some of these things again. So this is my little bid to do that. So I'm going to address his 12 questions for progressives, even if I'm not perhaps the kind of person that he is minded of when he made these questions. Now, before he actually embarks on his questions in his video, and it's a 30-minute video, he says that he's talked about quite a lot of people who are socially progressive, and he's been quite dissatisfied with those conversations because he still doesn't have a clear understanding of what these things mean to them, or what their end goals are, or that they have a kind of coherent perspective. So what I would ask, I'm assuming he will watch this video, is that once he's watched it, he will come back to me. It doesn't have to be in a video, it can be in a comment, that's up to him. And I would like to know if he feels I've satisfied those criteria. Does he regard my progressive position as coherent? Does he regard my progressive position as answering his questions, giving him some concrete things to go at in terms of the questions that he's asked here? Okay, now what I will say is as well, I nearly always say, or if I don't, it's only because I've forgotten to, go and watch the original video. In this instance, doubly so, because it's a video that's well worth watching on its own merit, not just to check that I'm not quote mining or straw manning, which is usually the reason that I say it. A video that is well worth watching. Pardon me. The Distributist is conservative in his politics. He comes from, I think, a religious conservative position. But the way that he outlines his positions is very interesting. I think he does a damn good job of it. And he doesn't just make the questions in the video, he doesn't just outline the questions, but he gives some of his objections to the answers that he's heard and some of the problems that he foresees, which makes it very, very interesting thing to watch. So go and have a look at that. Now, what I'm not doing particularly in this video is addressing the things that he says in his video. I'm more addressing the 12 questions themselves, but I will be minded of of the things that he said in his video. But where I sort of deviate more off the question and tackle the things that he said in his video, I'll try and make that clear. Okay, let's get cracking with the list. So I'll leave the list of questions in the footnotes of this one. Have a look at the questions yourself. Maybe even consider sending him a video response yourself, because they're damn interesting questions. Now, I'm going to group the questions together a bit. Question 1 is on equality, and he says himself that this is perhaps the most important question of the lot. But then his questions drift onto other things, and then it goes back on question 9 and 10, back to questions of equality again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of join those 3 questions together. So let's tackle questions 1, 9, and 10. At the same time. So question 1, what does equality mean in the progressive context? What would it take for society to be equal? Then jumping to question 9, is there a stopping point in the pursuit of equality in some particular sphere or level? And then question 10, I kind of have a bit of an issue with the question. Let's deal with that straight away. What ends are legitimate in the pursuit of equality? Ends are legitimate, and then he lists social engineering, restrictions on liberty, draconian punishments. It seems to me they're not ends, are they? That isn't an end. You don't think, right, let's try and achieve social engineering, let's try and achieve restrictions on liberty. They would be means to achieve your ends being some kind, some flavour of equality. So I think that question should actually say what means are legitimate in the pursuit of equality. So let me try and amalgamate those questions and give you my perspective here. Now, I think I can't really give you my progressive answer to this until I've criticised the progressive answers that's come to be seen as the kind of, become the de facto progressive answer to this. And I can't really go any further before first, I've got to frame this, I think, in terms of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, even though that's well-trodden ground. But I hope you'll see why this is really important here, is because I think it's reasonable of me to suggest, and I'm certainly not the first person to suggest this, that a lot of people who fly the flag for progressivism will happily, if you put them on the spot and say, okay, look, just tell me exactly what is it you're looking for here. Is it equality of opportunity or is it equality of outcome? If you put them on the spot, they will say, oh, it's equality of opportunity. But actually, when you start to get down to brass tacks and look at individual examples, it seems that they are never happy unless equality of outcome has been achieved. It's almost as if they are labouring under some kind of assumption that equality of outcome will necessarily follow in each and every case from equality of opportunity. And it seems to me that to believe that, you either have to make an assumption which I regard as wholly unwarranted and extremely unlikely, or you've got to take part into some kind of social engineering, some kind of social jerry-rigging that is way beyond that which I think most of us, even most of us who are progressives, if we gave it some thought, would regard as reasonable. So the first of those little criticisms with regard to that is this thing. I mean, I think we all accept, every one of us accepts that as individuals we are born with intrinsic differences, that society shapes us but not entirely, right? That, I mean, we know the physiological concerns of us as human beings as we develop. I think all of us accept that there is a difference, that we are born with differences, that we'll have different heights, that we'll have different weights, different builds, different levels of strength, different levels of cardiovascular fitness, different levels of resistance to disease and things like that. And that part of that is innate, it is intrinsic within individuals. And the same with our talents and our intellectual abilities, our cognitive abilities, that they vary from individual as individual, are not all born as blank slates. I think almost everybody agrees with that. Everybody accepts that. And yet it seems to me that quite a lot of people who come from a progressive standpoint seem to, maybe unthinkingly at times, take this position that when you put then people in social groups, whether it's ethnic groups or sexual groups or any other kind of group, that somehow all those differences will be identically statistically represented in each one of those groups, even though we know that that isn't the case, right? We know that the Mbuti tribe of Pygmies in Africa have an average male height of under 5 foot, and the Dinka tribe in Africa have an average male height of about 6 foot. So we know that these things are not the case, and you could point to example after example after example. It isn't just fucking culture that means that every single person, bar I think two, that has ever run run the 100 meters under 10 seconds comes from West African ethnic groups, which are crap at distance running, and yet the East African ethnic groups, especially those around the Great Rift Valley and especially the Kalenjin, have dominated those that require cardiovascular capabilities, that require the distance running capabilities. They have dominated those things for decades now. So we accept that these differences are there in average characteristics. And so we get down to this business of statistical equality of groups versus equality of individuals. And it's a little bit of it's a bit of a sore point, this, of course, because when we apply for something, we apply as individuals, do we not? We do not apply as groups. And so if I apply for a job, and somebody says, well, look, we're not going to offer you the job because we're trying to get statistical equality of groups. And we've already had two guys with receding hairlines apply, and we've just given them a job. We can hardly employ a third person. That's no good to me. I don't get a warm glow thinking, well, that's good. A couple of other people with slap heads have just been given jobs in this occupation, so I don't need to worry about that. I apply to that job as an individual, and it's exactly the same way when I apply to the job as a man, as a male-bodied person, when I apply as a Northern European or everything else. What I want, the gold standard for me, is that I want to be given equality of opportunity in terms of an individual, and to be discriminated against. Yes, discriminated against. That isn't a bad word, on grounds that are relevant, because obviously any process by which you apply for a job has to discriminate. You wouldn't want an indiscriminate process. You wouldn't want all the applications names just to be stuck in a fucking tombola and a name drawn from random. But the important thing that everybody wants is individuals that we are discriminated against on relevant criteria and not on irrelevant criteria that are based upon prejudices and upon ideas of the average characteristics of some group to which we belong. And yet we have this idea, if we are minded of equality of opportunity, of outcome, then we have to do one of two things, right? What we would have to do is either we either have to have this, what I think is an almost it's almost vanishingly unlikely scenario that in all relevant cases, all these different social groups, however we slice and dice them, will be all equally skilled in every single ability within that group, statistically speaking. Or we have to start jerry-rigging the system in terms of uprating things that aren't rated by society to artificially level things off. So if I can give you an idea of what I mean there, basketball players in the United States can earn huge sums of money, right, as a basketball player. Limbo dancers and jockeys do very, very poorly in comparison. And yet, to go back to our Pygmy and Booty tribe and Dinka, clearly the Dinka would be more greatly, if everything cultural was equal, the Dinka, and given equality of opportunity, the Dinka would be more heavily represented in the NBA, and the Mbuti would be more heavily represented in limbo dancing and in horse riding. Okay, so the Dinka would be faring better in terms of what their earnings potential is. So what are we going to do? Are we going to jerry-rig the system and insist that sponsors or the government, the state, just fund money into limbo dancing and horse racing to level it off? Obviously, that is a fucking ridiculous suggestion to make, but that is the level you have to go down if there are statistical differences in skills and in physiological and cognitive differences between different social groups. Okay, so that's kind of the position that I would critique, that I would criticize. in terms of a progressive position. But I need to give you a positive answer, right? Because I suggest that I am socially progressive on this issue. And I do believe that there are inequalities of opportunity. So let me outline 3 for you. I want you to tell me, Distributist, if you think these are unreasonable, right? If this isn't answering the question that you want answering. So what you talked about, you said that everybody, you don't have to be a progressive to be in favour of these things. In fact, almost everybody, at least everybody who's on board with a broader liberal project, want equality of opportunity, okay, and by which they mean legal. They mean legal equality. But that's when you said yourself, that is where most people draw the line in terms of legal equality. I've got to say, what I want to say is that is a stunningly naive position. If your position is that as long as you have legal equality, then equality has been achieved. But I think it's more cynical than that. I think as a position that is willfully myopic. And I know there'll be a lot of people who watch my videos, a lot of people who agree with me, who like my stuff, will say, I always watch your stuff, Jim, and I nearly always agree with you, who will take umbrage at what I've said there. But hear me out on this. This is why I say it's willingly myopic. Because even in the context where that is relevant, let's say employment, clearly there is a lot more beside that. If I apply to a job, and one of the characteristics that you really can't discriminate unless it is relevant, which it is in very, very few cases, is on the grounds, within the United Kingdom, is on the grounds of religion. That is a protected characteristic, and that includes my status as an atheist. So if I applied for a job as, let's say, an ambulance technician, and I was interviewed for the job and I underwent all the tests and they found out that I was an atheist, I mentioned it, and they decided that one of them didn't like the fact that I'm an atheist, right? They could not legally not give me the job because I'm an atheist. But you know as well as I do, right, that me proving that they haven't given me the job because I'm an atheist it is nigh on impossible. Now, when you deal with very, very large employers who have things set down to the letter in terms of the recruitment process, you may have the possibility that you can demonstrate that. But it is trivially easy otherwise to find. You have me as the atheist and you have another candidate who, let's say, is a Christian, and you're a Christian and you'd rather be working alongside this Christian here, right? And it is trivially easy for you to find one particular thing where I've underperformed relative to them, and you go, that was the reason. Yeah, this is why we haven't selected Noel Plum here to give the job to. It's because we just weren't really happy with the answer he gave there or whatever, right? And so you just point at that. And how do I prove that that isn't the case? That no, really, it's actually the fact that I'm an atheist. Okay, so that is an issue. And that is not an issue that has been solved by legislation. And it's not an issue that will be solved by more legislation. But this is something that I think we need to tackle, and this is a progressive issue. How do I think we tackle it? Well, as I say, I don't think we tackle it through legislation, and I also don't think we tackle it through browbeating people and shouting at people and telling them what fucking awful individuals they are. There may be a place for that occasionally, but I think that what this requires is a change of attitudes. And because it is so easy to hide these particular prejudices, I think it requires a willingness, right? It is something that people have to willingly take on board. So it is something that progressives like myself have to actually sell to people, not something that we can demand. But those kind of change of attitudes are things that I would like to see. I would like to see less people who want to, are minded to discriminate on the grounds of these irrelevant characteristics, such as the colour of somebody's skin, such as somebody's religion or lack of religion, such as their gender or physical, biological sex, such as their sexual orientation, etc., right? And to understand why that isn't a very good way for society to act, and to see why they don't need to fear changing their position, and moreover not just convincing them, right, because we all have hard and fast limits as to what we're prepared to accept, but to influence to put the argument across to their children and to their children's children, and to start to create people, to shape people that are more open-minded to these things and are themselves more progressive in their attitudes towards equality of opportunity and don't want to discriminate on these particular grounds. So that would be one of the things. The other things would be more with regard to children, and one of them is regard to equality of resources with regard to children. I think that's a progressive issue and a very reasonable progressive issue. But again, now this is really interesting. This is really interesting because when we talk about issues of equality of opportunity, and you talk about end points and, you know, how far is too far and what would it take and all this lot, I don't believe that absolute equality of opportunity is desirable, even somebody who advocates equality of opportunity, because I think there are other things. We start to run into conflict. And one of the conflicts is what can people reasonably do with their own resources. And I think it's entirely reasonable to be a rich person, okay? There's nothing wrong with being a rich person and having wealth. And I don't think we should be able to say to a rich person, no, you cannot spend money on anything that will benefit your children or your children's education. I don't think that's an ethical thing, to be able to disbar people from spending their wealth in such a way. And I also think, and this is something I want to mention in videos for a while and never had a chance to shoehorn it in, but again, there are some people, I've heard this said, having these kinds of discussions where I've said it can't be ethical to stop people inheriting the wealth, which is an inequality of opportunity, of course, being able to inherit large wealth of people. And they've said, well, why isn't it? What's unethical? Why can't we stop people inheriting their parents' wealth? There's no hard and fast rule why that should be morally wrong. But that seems just such a naive position to take. Why? Because if you stop people inheriting, you stop people bequeathing. And this is really what it's not about. It's not about your right to inherit. It's about the other person. It's about your parents' right to bequeath to you their worldly possessions, their wealth. And if you deny people the right to bequeath, you put old people in the most horrible position imaginable, where they have to try and preempt their own death and to give their resources away to those they wish to give their resources away well in advance of the time when they anticipate their own death, which can leave them absolutely over a fucking barrel if their kids turn out to be not quite as nice and as reasonable as they hope that they would be. I don't want to put old people in that position, so I have to allow them the chance to bequeath things after their death, which means I have to allow the people the chance to inherit, which means you're never going to achieve absolute equality of opportunity. Now, the only other thing that you can do there is to say, okay, the state will jump in, and whatever the richest people will provide for their children, okay, the state will provide the same for everybody else. Apart from the fact that's absolutely impractical and the state just does not have the resources to do that. How much does that disincentivize anybody? What is the point spending money on your children if it's just if everybody else will just get the same? And what is the point bettering yourself if you can neither spend that on your future generations or allow them to inherit that? So I don't think that is the way to carry on. But within that, I think there is quite a lot of scope for more equality of resources for children in terms of a minimum standard. I think that's where the state functions in every Western society. And in most societies with any reasonable state of advancement around the world, is the state tries to provide a minimum standard for children, and that of course includes free education for every child. But I think we can do more than we are doing at the moment. Right, I think we can do more towards achieving greater equality of opportunity by investing more in children and looking at allocating more to some children that really do need it, both in terms of their schooling and in terms of their socio-economic perspective in their home life and how they're treated at home and the abilities that their parents have to bring them up. Maybe the books that they have in the home and things like that. I think we can do more there than we are doing. That would be the second of the 3 progressive points that I would want to chime in on with regard to this. The third is something I mentioned in a video before, which is a more neutral environment for children. Let me explain what I mean by that. Look, I am on board with people who believe that there are innate differences between people. Let's say innate differences between men and women. And I don't have a problem with that. I'm nice and easy with that and chilled about that. But in terms of gender and biological sex, what concerns me is that we bring our children up in a way that reinforces that, right? So we may say, oh no, as long as our children are free to judge for themselves what jobs they go into, what courses they take, what paths their lives take, then what does it matter if more boys do this than girls, if more men do this than women? And I would agree with that. But the problem is that the way that we portray society prejudices them on top of whatever innate characteristics that they have. Now, I think that things have gotten better. If you look at the children's programs that are made today rather than the children's programs that were made 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I think we are working towards trying to provide perhaps more of a blank slate approach to allow the child's innate preferences to come to the surface, but I do think that we can do more than that in terms of providing a neutral environment for children. Now, I don't believe that we can go the whole hog. We're going to still advertise some toys and things more for girls than boys and for boys more than girls, and I don't think that we can hamstring manufacturers of these toys away from that. But I think, for example, as a parent, and we should be encouraging parents to encourage their girls, for example, to play with traditionally boys' toys as well as with girls' toys, which is something that does not always happen. If at the end of that the young girl avers away from that and still wants to just play exclusively with dolls, well then so be it. Actually, that tends not to be the problem. If you look at young girls and their toy choices, they tend to be much more Catholic, by which I mean with a small c in terms of wide-ranging. The problem actually is their greater levels of polarization with regard to boys. That's the bigger problem. And I think as a father of a young boy, part of my progressive outlook on his development is to encourage him to play with dolls. And I've done that. We've bought him a doll and we've encouraged him to play with a doll and had some success with that. Why? Because I think it's useful. Something that I've suffered from as a father is that I've not been encouraged when I was young and as I grew up to handle babies and to be used and to see that as something normal for me to hold a baby. And if you look at men and how they are around babies, they're often very, very uncomfortable. And I think part of that isn't innate. It's just the way that we culture men. We culture young girls to be comfortable picking up babies and to handling babies and to be around babies and to see nothing wrong with that, and yet we actually kind of push boys away from that as if that's something that they shouldn't be doing. Now, as it turns out, he still enjoys playing more with his mechanical toys, which is kind of what you would expect generally as an average for a boy rather than a girl, but I'm fine with that. That's fine. He's made his own choices, but he still has those options available. Okay, all right, so this has been a really long answer to this question here, but it's been perhaps the most important question that you've asked, and it's tackled 3 questions. So really, what I would be looking for are changes of attitudes, not more legislation, but changes of attitudes on these issues, and encouraging people not to want to discriminate on irrelevant criteria, but to understand the benefits of not doing so. More equality of resources for children, not an absolute equality of resources and therefore opportunity. I don't think that can ever be achieved. But more equality of resources and also a more neutral environment to encourage children so that actually it is those innate choices that come to the surface. If at the end of that 90% of firefighters are still men, 90% of nurses are still women, I'm absolutely cool with that. No problem with that whatsoever. I'm not target driven, but I would like that to be made in a neutral environment for children where it really is those innate differences, if they exist, that floats to the surface. Okay, so I think that hopefully hopefully answers a lot of what I've discussed there, has answered that. And in terms of what ends are legitimate in the pursuit of equality, social engineering, restrictions of liberty, those are things, we tend to view these things in very polarized terms, but these are things that we do anyway, right? We always engage in social engineering and have since the year dot. Almost everything that we do. I mean, you're a Catholic, right? If that isn't social engineering, I don't know what is. If Catholic parents bringing up and socializing their kids as Catholics, that is social engineering. And we restrict people's liberties all the time. I don't think we should start setting hard and fast rules here. We need to look at these things on a case-by-case basis and not start making sweeping statements about them. Just in terms of the stopping point and can we ever be satisfied with it, I pointed out no in terms of the equality of outcome, but there are two which some people ultimately see as a kind of end goal, but there are two other issues here. Really, one is that, as I've said, in terms of equality of opportunity would require equality of resources, and I don't think that that is ethical. You have to do too many unethical things to give every child absolutely equal resources. So that's always going to be an inequality, and that will always be a bone of contention. And then there's also something that I pointed out in a video recently that I jokingly called Noelgon's law. You'd have to watch the video to see why I called it that. But the point that I made out is that equality isn't... The time when we know equality has been achieved is not when nobody is complaining, it's when all groups are complaining equally. And this is the final point to wrap up this equality, is that's just the way that things are, I'm afraid, is that it seems that people need better than equal treatment before they start feeling that they are getting equal treatment. So yes, this moaning will always take place, and yes, we will always be having these discussions. Okay, that's that one. Let's move on to the questions on racism. So question 2, what is racism? Who is racist? How much does it matter if someone is racist? I have a lot of sympathy for the comments that the Distributist makes in his video with regard to this, when he says it's kind of like all the gloves are off when it comes to racism now, and seemingly everything's labelled as racism, as racist, and there is so many different definitions, so many things incorporated, so much conflation between these different definitions. And something he talks about, it's something that I labelled some time ago now as smearing through equivocation by proxy that takes place with regard to racism. Whereas what you do is you talk about something and label something or someone as racist, and you say, oh, well, all I mean by this, I'm not meaning anything insulting by that or anything that you should be worried about. Please freely accept the term racist, right? But the smearing about through equivocation by proxy is that as you say that, you're effectively smearing someone because there is an equivocation. There is an equivocation taking place. You might not be the one making the equivocation, but you're using a particular definition of racism to label somebody a racist, knowing full well that other people will hear you doing that and draw a very different conclusion. And that is something that I think is quite worrying. And I do think that the idea, the whole usage of racism and racist and the way that we're going about this right now seems to be way over the top, way overstated to the point where it's not helpful, right? And so that would be the first thing that I would say with regard to this. Now, as to the question, how much does it matter if someone is racist? And I think this boils it down to not just racist. We could talk about all kinds of things. We could talk about sexist. We could talk about ageist. And are these things ever legitimate or are they not? And to give you an example of where I kind of draw the line with this, because I do draw the line, right? I think there are some things we can do that I would regard as racist. And if you want to know, I give a definition similar to what the Distributist gives, which is that it is discriminating against somebody on the grounds of that particular thing. So it would be discriminating on someone on the grounds of their ethnic group would be racism, okay? So to give you an example of what I think is acceptable and what is unacceptable, let me give you an example of ageism that might concern me. Let's say you had a picture of me in all my 45-year-old glory, and you showed that picture to a 20-year-old woman and said to her, this this 45-year-old guy here, would you be prepared to go on a date with him, or to have sex with him, or to get married to him, or whatever? And she said, no, I wouldn't. He's too old, right? I wouldn't be prepared to do those kinds of things with somebody of his age. I'd rule it out on terms of age. I don't have a problem with that, right? Is that ageism? Well, going by the way that I would define ageism, yes, she is clearly discriminating against me. She's discerning between somebody who's 45 and somebody who is younger than 45. That is a process of discrimination. It's not an indiscriminate process, and she is doing that in terms with reference to age. So she's discriminating on the grounds of age, so that is ageism. But do I think that that is unwarranted? Do I think that that is unjustified? Do I think that that is unacceptable? Absolutely not. I think that's absolutely legitimate, and I could understand some of the reasons, very reasonable reasons, why she may feel like that. However, if that same girl was interviewing me for the job as an accountant, let's say, and she didn't give me the job on the count that I'm 45 years old, despite the fact that I would be just as capable perhaps of doing this job as somebody who's 20 or 25 and could still do this job for another 20, 25 years. So it's not just I'm on the point of retirement or something, right? That's not a concern. But she didn't give me the job because of my age. That would be ageism, and I think that would be unacceptable for her to do. So that is the difference for me. It's not just in terms of what it is that is being discriminated on the grounds of. You've also got to look at the context in which that is taking place. And there are going to be some contexts which are legitimate and some contexts which are not legitimate. Now, what is something of a counterpoint to this is that we need to acknowledge that some people define these terms, racism, sexism, ageism, in such a way that effectively with regard to wrongness, it's kind of tautological. It's the difference between, I suppose, murder is wrong and killing is wrong. If you define murder as killing when killing is wrong, then of course murder is wrong. It's wrong by definition. It's killing when killing is wrong, and it's the same thing here. Some people will say that, well, no, racism is discriminating on someone on the grounds of race or ethnic group when it is unwarranted and wrong for you to do so. So with regard to my ageism example, with regard to me, they'd say, no, as far as we're concerned, a 20-something woman deciding that you're too old for to want, not wanting to date people as old as you are, isn't ageism because it isn't wrong. Whereas in the workplace, discriminating on the grounds of a job that you're more than capable of doing at the age of 45 would be wrong, so therefore that is ageism. Now, I don't really have a problem with that. That's a reasonable way of defining it as well. But of course, we get through to this smearing through equivocation by proxy business again, don't we? And so I'm mindful of that. So what I tend to do is, even though I might see some things as technically racist, technically ageist, technically sexist, because they are fulfilling the criteria of discrimination and discrimination on the grounds of that particular criteria, I wouldn't start bandying those definitions around, those labels around willy-nilly on individuals, because I am aware that that can be interpreted in a very different way. But I think some people are perhaps a lot more willing to do that because they couldn't give a fuck, and in some ways they're quite happy for you to struggle under that conflation of definitions, really, that equivocation that can take place. And of course, it has to be borne in mind, right, that some of the times when some of these discriminations might come about might be for quite innocuous reasons. For example, a lot of women, to go back to our Mbuti and Dinka tribesmen, a lot of women prefer taller men. So is that racist? Because clearly the pygmies, the Mbutis, aren't going to get much of a fucking look in there if there's a few Dinkas in the room, are they? Because they're all going to be way too short for those men. So effectively that woman would be discriminating on ethnic grounds there. But I don't think many of us would regard that as wrong, as racist in a wrong way. I hope that answers that particular question. So to question 3, can there ever be inequality between social or cultural groups that is legitimate or benign? When can we assume inequality is circumstantial and not malicious? The second bit's probably a little bit harder, a little bit more intractable. Can there ever be inequality between social or cultural groups that is legitimate or benign? Absolutely there can be. And I think it's kind of interesting, actually, that typically a lot of people who are progressive, and particularly those that are from a stronger left-wing perspective than my own, are vehemently and adamantly dyed-in-the-wool multiculturalists and champion the rights of these different groups to have their different cultures and to be able to maintain and in many cases reinforce their different cultures within a multicultural society. And yet you've got a real conflict of interest here, because if you allow people to have their different cultures, then surely you are bound as a result of that to see inequalities of outcome that result from that, and in fact inequalities of opportunity. So for example, one thing that is clear that is in the United States, people of East Asian ethnic groups and of those cultural groups seem to do very, very well in education. In fact, as I showed in a video some time ago, it appears that there's actually some active discrimination against those groups in terms of the SAT score that they're expected to achieve, that they're actually being penalised for doing as well as they are. Now, if you ask people why are these groups doing so exceptionally well, there are a few brave souls who will say, well, perhaps, just perhaps, there may be some innate intellectual characteristics that they possess, that on average they may be of slightly higher intelligence. But certainly anybody who would dare to suggest that is unlikely to come from the slightly more hardline progressive camp. I keep an open mind to that particular one. Most of them will say it is their culture, that they have a culture of hard work, of education, of drumming education into their children from a young age, and that is what they are benefiting from. But here's the thing, if you accept them, if you accept that you will grant them their right to their culture and to their cultural differences, then they are going to perform better than other groups, including my own cultural groups. Of course, in the United Kingdom, it is white working class boys that are performing at school worse than any other group whatsoever. Nowadays. So we're right at the fucking bottom of the stack in the United Kingdom, the group that I am from. So you have this kind of thing. If you're prepared to allow them their culture, then you have to accept an inequality resulting from it. What are you going to do? Are you going... Seemingly, American society, universities at least, are happy at the moment with penalising them for their culture, which seems a really counterintuitive thing to do. So can there ever be inequalities? Yes, there can. And of course also in terms, because you just said social or cultural groups, some of the ways that we define social groups of course are in terms of income bracket and things like that. And so unless we're going to have some absolute sort of communist state where you generation on generation keep resetting the clock to make sure that everybody has the same level of income and wealth and has each according to their needs, etc., etc., then you are going to have those inequalities, and it would be a much poorer society as far as I'm concerned if those inequalities were taken away. There would be nothing to strive to anymore. Again, I suppose we come back to what I talked about in the beginning. My progressive stance is making sure that everybody starts from a basic minimum standard and working to raise that minimum standard, not just saying, well, the minimum standard that we've got now, that'll do, right? That's fine. That's more of a conservative position. I want, or a aggressive position in some cases. I want to see to raise that minimum standard. That's my progressive approach. It's not minded of some kind of absolute equality that's going to result from it, because I don't expect that, and I wouldn't necessarily be happy if that was achieved. On to question 4. Can a government legitimately act to defend the interests or continuity of a particular culture or race? Can a non-government institution? Well, look, yeah, I mean, I think we all accept that can happen and that has to happen. I mean, we let's take it. Let's take the sting out of this. First off, we accept that there are parts of the world. Let's go outside of what I would say. I think we first need to draw a line between the global community and that which lies outside the global community. So if you go to a place like Brazil, if you go to a place like New Guinea, where there are many, many dozens of uncontacted tribes or barely contacted tribes, right? We expect governments to act to legitimately defend their interests. And we also have slightly different standards for that which lies outside the global community. Some of these tribes are doing things that, if it happened as part of the global community, we'd find absolutely abhorrent. In some cases, we'd regard as child abuse, child sexual abuse. And that's perhaps something that we could chime upon in one of the later answers as you move on to that. But also we have, we have that African tribe where the men tie a fucking vine around their leg and jump from that very precarious looking wooden tower. I can tell you that would not be allowed under health and safety, right? Pretty much anywhere in the global community, and yet we accept the fact. We need to be culturally sensitive at the same time and not be imperialistic towards groups that have not absorbed themselves into the global community. That's a more extreme example. I know that's not what you were thinking of. You're thinking of things, I think, more in line with your own status as a Catholic, and then you talked about things like white nationalists and things like that. Let me talk about things such as your own group, the Catholics, and what I think is acceptable and what I think is unacceptable. Okay, let me give you some concrete examples, because I think that's the kind of thing that you want to go at. What I think is acceptable for a government to be minded and to act to defend, in terms of the Marriage Equality Act in the United Kingdom, the government accepted that it would be wrong to try and pressure religious groups, Catholics, Church of England, Islamic groups, etc., to conduct gay marriage ceremonies, right? That they can decide for themselves whether they wish to do that or not. Now, there are quite a lot of people, and there'll be some people who side with me on a great number of things, who believe that they should be forced to carry these things out. I certainly don't. I mean, from my perspective, this is one of those issues where effectively you either come out with it and say, listen, you Catholics, you Jews, you Christians, you Islams, you're full of shit. Everything you believe is an absolute fucking nonsense, and we're prepared to tell you that, or you cut them some slack. Because effectively, if you say to Catholics, let's say, no, you have to conduct gay marriages, what you're saying is, we're telling you now that what you believe is wrong, right? And you can come back to us and say, well, no, this our religion mandates this, and God is saying this. The only answer that I can give you, because if your God actually existed, which I don't believe for a moment, but I accept that you believe it, if your God actually existed and mandated this, then what grounds do I have to say, well, shit, right? Because if your God did exist and he's omniscient and omnipotent and he says gay marriage is wrong, who am I to naysay that and say, well, that doesn't matter, you've still got to do it? I'd have to take account of that, wouldn't I? So if I don't take account of that and I force your hand on that, I am effectively, to all intents and purposes, saying your God does not exist. And I'm not prepared to go that far. So I am prepared to cut you that cultural slack. And it doesn't preclude anybody from getting married. It doesn't preclude gay couples from getting married. They just can't get married in a Catholic church. Well, I'd advise them not to get fucking married in a Catholic church to begin with, quite honestly. That is an internal issue for the Catholic Church to decide, for the Church of England to decide, etc., etc., etc. But then if you look at another issue that we have in the UK, like faith schools, I take an entirely different perspective on that. Not because I don't think I would happily champion the rights of the Catholic Church to have to fund a school that just accepts Catholic children. But what I won't accept is the situation we have now, when the state, my taxes are funding schools that are only available for Catholic children. And there are towns that I could live in where my tax would guarantee my child the choice of one school Whereas an Anglican or a Catholic child may have the choice of 2 or 3 schools. They can pick of state schools that are funded by the state, so they can pick the very best school out of that choice. I'm precluded that choice despite the fact that I am paying the same fucking taxes. Now, if I'm paying the same taxes, I should get the same choices. Of course, the government's position on this is that, well, we're only responding to what parents want, and Catholic parents want these Catholic schools, and Church of England Anglican parents want these Anglican schools. No fucking shit, they want these fucking schools. Why wouldn't they? Everybody would want special treatment. I'm quite sure these Catholic parents would quite prefer to have NHS Catholic only hospitals, and some of these Anglican parents would be quite prepared to accept Anglican only lanes on the fucking motorway that nobody else can drive down. I'm sure they would, but hard shit, my taxes go towards these things the same as they do. So I don't regard that as a reasonable way to enshrine their rights. So I hope you can see the difference there. Okay, it depends how these things are funded, really. Now, what you talked about, the last bit of this is that you talked about white nationalists, didn't you? You were talking about white nationalists. The problem that I have with groups like that is it's impossible now to extirpate that group from society. If you're a white nationalist and you want, well, we want to do our own thing in our own area with our own culture, well, it's kind of hard shit now. The cat's out the bag. We're all living together in these multi-cultural, multi-ethnic environment. So unless we're going to have some kind of process of fucking ethnic cleansing, I don't see any reasonable way to do that and still distribute state-funded resources in a way that is equitable between these different groups. So no, I don't really think that that is possible. I don't have a problem. You talked about other countries having different regard to immigration and things like that. Look, when it comes to that, I think that's a very, very different issue to white nationalism, right? Immigration and white nationalism, you mention them together. No, fuck you for doing that in a way. They're very different things. Because immigration, you could take a country like Japan, which has had very little immigration, and if that's the way that they want to do things, they can set their own rules, and it's not for me as somebody who doesn't live there to tell them, well, you simply must accept more, and you must do this, and you must do that. And it's the same thing with Donald Trump's fucking wall that he wants to build across the border with Mexico. As far as I am concerned, as somebody who doesn't live in the United States of America, he can crack on with that. I don't see any ethical concerns with that. I see some ethical concerns with some of the things he said against Mexicans, but I don't have any more ethical concern with that than I have with the fact that we have a large stretch of water that forms an even more impenetrable boundary around almost the entirety of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Right, if you want to build a barrier and you want to control your immigration, that is up to you. I don't think, as long as it's not done on some kind of horrible racist lines, I don't think that is an ethical concern, and that is a concern for the people of the United States to have internally. And I think you need to separate issues of immigration and people coming into the country with issues like white nationalism, which is concerned with how you treat people that are already in there, that are already mixed together. And living with cultures and different ethnic groups, different racial groups, etc., different groups of sexual orientation, etc., all living together. And there you have to function as a cohesive whole. You can't carry out the fucking bag with regard to that. Moving on to question 5. Are some identities more legitimate or true than others? Does the historical role a group played make it more or less legitimate? You know, I think for me, a lot of the times it's not whether an identity is more legitimate or not, it's whether it's more useful. Because why do we give different things identities? We give them identities so we can discern between them and do some kind of reasonable taxonomic process for the betterment of everybody involved, for the betterment of those individuals and those individuals that are labouring under those identities, and for the betterment of everybody else. And so I suppose when it comes to identities The difference would be that if you take an identity of a group like the Catholic Church, like the Church of England, for example, those are quite useful identities in some ways because they're quite well established and we have some kinds of boundaries of what they involve. Not necessarily quite as useful now as they were. I can tell you that we have a situation in the United Kingdom where 70% of people put Christian on the census, and yet only 50% of people in the United Kingdom believe that a God or gods exist. So there's a substantial number of people who labour under the identity of Christian who don't even believe in fucking God. Never mind anything that you would regard as more fundamental to Christianity, such as the idea that Jesus Christ was the Jewish Messiah and perhaps also the Son of God. Okay, so we have these kinds of problems with identities, but at least we have some kind of basic taxonomic structure when it comes to things like religion and Christianity and the ways in which that you can split it apart into Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, Protestantism, and then different Protestant traditions, etc., etc. Now, when you talk about things like, which I think you're probably referring to things like the different gender identities and lists of 40 or 50 or 60 gender identities, the issue for me is not whether or not they are legitimate. It's whether it's a meaningful and sensible way of doing these things when you end up with these Heinz 57 varieties of gender identities and you can't even really give a definition for most of them, and seemingly many of them are just different words for the same thing. And I don't see that is helpful, right? It's not a useful way of applying identities, whether or not those identities are legitimate. So the problem that I have is that in the name of progressivism, what is happening is that this idea that, well, everybody can have whatever identity they want, label themselves however they want, and they're free to do so, and we should just accept those labels. And the problem with this is that people have very individualistic tendencies, and they want labels that nobody else has. They want sort of very idiosyncratic labels, and that isn't very helpful, and we know that it isn't very helpful, and in most spheres that we don't allow that, all right? I mean, you can trump up whatever crap label you want, but when it comes to actually doing anything with those labels, we start specifying labels. Now, with regard to gender, I think that probably man and woman is not sufficient, and that other gender labels and gender identities, I'm absolutely, from my progressive side, on board with more labels. But what I'm not on board with is this fucking non-taxonomic free-for-all where the numbers of labels can just expand exponentially, because that doesn't help us. That doesn't tell us anything, does it? The labels become next to useless when labels get applied in that kind of way. So question 6, and in many ways question 6 segues into 7 and 8, but I'll try and tackle them separately. How serious is an act of non-consensual, physical contact with no physical harm? Does it matter if this contact is sexual? Yeah, sure, it matters if it's sexual. Why does it matter if it's sexual? Because we've decided it matters if it's sexual. We feel that it matters if it's sexual. And after all, if we're going to start talking about what matters, there is no objective standard just floating out there in the universe of what's going to matter to Homo sapiens, to some particular species of great ape that we just got to kind of stumble upon. We decide what matters, and in many ways, and I know this chimes in with the questions you're asking, there is a cultural aspect to that, quite a strong cultural aspect, and you could arrive legitimately at different solutions as to what matters in some cultures than you would in others. And I accept what you're saying with regard to things like sexual contact. It may well be that in some cultures sexual contact isn't as big a thing as it is in other, or having sex with somebody of a particular age, if somebody is 13 or 14 or whatever. In our culture, we would regard that as an abhorrence, as something which could lead to dysfunctional and harmed adults, and yet in some other cultures, we're going back again to some of these uncontacted tribes that lie outside of the global community. If you was to take somebody out of that culture and stop that early sexual contact, you may actually create somebody who is dysfunctional in terms of their culture. They would then stand out and they would feel there was something wrong with them. So these are really quite complicated things, and I would suggest to you they are inextricably linked into the culture that we actually have. Now, does that mean we should start trying to look to go down other lines or necessarily be more broad-minded within our own culture, I think we've got to be very, very careful, because we have this kind of social contractarianism that we're required to do for these things to function. We all need to have some kind of common set of standards to some degree for these things to work, and that limits how tolerant we could be. And I think that the goals, what we're aiming for, is quite reasonable goals. We want to protect people, particularly protect people who are vulnerable, and that is the direction in which we are going. Now, there may be other solutions that achieve the same goal, but you can't really start carrying out those kinds of social experiments, right? And it seems a legitimate goal that we have, and it seems a legitimate path that we're taking to achieve those goals. Both the ends and the means seem legitimate, and so I don't really know what problem that you would have with regard to that, given that kind of perspective. So that was question 6. Question 7, do people's emotions and cultural perceptions factor into what consent is, or how heinous the violation of consent is? Well, I think you know my answer from the answer I've given to question 6. Absolutely it does. But of course we do have these problems, and you mentioned it, I think, that when cultures rub up against one another in a multicultural society, you do have problems of one culture overextending into another, doing things that are not culturally appropriate, right? Inappropriate behavior. And you also have one culture trying to impose itself on another and saying, well, we regard this as wrong for us, and so damn well we're going to start saying that it's wrong for you. And that really does run into some difficult problems, doesn't it? And I think the only thing that you can do then is to try and substantiate the grounds upon which you're making that claim. I have to say, if the grounds in which you're making that claim is God exists and God says what you're doing is wrong, that's a difficult one to feature in a multicultural society when people believe in different gods and a great number of people don't believe in any God whatsoever. But if in terms of your actual culture, some practices are different, such that speaking to people in certain ways, let's say, or certain, perhaps, certain being more sexually aggressive within your culture is regarded as the norm and it would be unacceptable in another culture, I think you can make a legitimate case then to have some cultural sensibilities and understand that cultures function in slightly different ways. Question 8, can any moral distinction be made between consensual sexual acts? If so, can stigma be legitimately brought by society against some sexual behaviour? Well, look, you made a big play on the video that you made with regard to bestiality, and the idea that bestiality is consensual, at least from the human perspective, and yet we put really big sentences in. You can go to prison for years for sucking your dog off, right? And so that was your grounds to, I think, shoehorn in what you want to say is, so can I as a Catholic make the same kind of protestations against you? I have to say, the whole bestiality thing, I think you're to blame for that, right? You religious fuckers are to blame for the fact that bestiality, I'm not here to defend bestiality really, but the fact that it gets this treatment that is out of all proportion for what actually takes place. After all, people will say things like, well, the reason that you can't fuck a sheep is because a sheep can't consent to being fucked, and they'll happily tell you that while they're tucking into a couple of lamb chops, as if the sheep has in some ways consented to you eating the fucking thing. We simply can't apply the same standards when we're talking to other animals, unless as you're tucking into lamb chops you're quite happy for me to tuck in to somebody's leg alongside you. So it doesn't really make any sense to me, and as things stand in the United Kingdom, as far as I'm aware, I could go round to my neighbour's dog and slowly kick it to death so that it dies in absolute agony, and I would receive less of a sentence than if I gave that fucking dog a blowjob. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me, and as far as I'm concerned, that is a throwback from your religious perspective. That's something that you are to be blamed for. In terms of bringing stigma to bear and moral distinctions being made to bear in terms of consensual sex acts, I would say no, as little as possible. Everything needs to be judged. Every case needs to turn on the facts. Every case needs to be judged on its individual merits, but as a general rule, I would say no. As long as people are of sound mind to do so. There was a case in Germany, quite an interesting case, of these two guys who consensually decided that one of them would eat the other one's penis, and I mean literally cut it off, fry it and eat it. And that is what happened. They signed documents to show that they'd agreed and they'd set it all up and that both parties were entering into it willingly. And as the one party who'd had his penis chopped off bled to death, the other guy fried and ate his penis. The sad part of the story, other than the fact that somebody had had their penis chopped off and bled to death, was slightly, it's kind of the most macabre black humour going, but slightly amusingly, he overcooked the penis. I mean, you can imagine that as you're slowly bleeding to death over what you're hoping is going to be not only the final sexual thrill of your life, but the greatest, that this cunt who's agreed to help you out has overcooked the fucking thing. But anyway, I'm kind of getting a little bit drawn away, perhaps, from the question. So that was question 8. Then we moved on, of course, to 9 and 10, which we've already tackled with on equality. So on to the last two questions. Question 11. Is ideological bias a problem in publicly funded spaces like universities? What about monopolistic social media? What is your criteria for no platforming? Okay, 3 questions in one. Is ideological bias a problem in publicly funded spaces like universities? I think it is, to a degree. I think there's always been ideological bias in universities. What you would hope is that the way that universities are structured and the people that run it are sufficiently open-minded that they will put their ideological biases to one side. Traditionally, universities have been left of the public consciousness, of the sort of Overton window, etc., etc. They function very much to the left of that. But they've had a very liberal idea, traditionally liberal idea, in terms of allowing people to have their perspectives. Unfortunately, the National Union of Students in the United Kingdom has never done anything even approaching that. And whilst they've purportedly been there to represent all students, they've probably, in terms of their politics, represented about 10% of students. And fuck them for all time for the way that they carry on as a representative group. But that bias in terms of the universities themselves needn't be that much of a problem, I don't think, although it seems with some of the recent events as if it's becoming more of a problem, which is why people are discussing it and railing against it. What about monopolistic social media? I don't believe social media generally is monopolistic, is it, in terms of left-right politics? I actually think that, if you look at most social media, that it accepts quite a broad range. And in terms of online media and new media, it seems to be much more forgiving in terms of the kinds of opinions than traditionally would be the case. And different media functions in different ways. I know on the television it's different in the United States and the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, on the television, we tend to have a system where the news on the television has to try and be neutral. Well, it has to be balanced, and it has to show both sides and invite people from both sides to give their opinions and try not to side with one particular political group or another. Whereas newspapers are allowed to be as biased as fuck, but you end up with newspapers on both sides. You end up with the Mail and the Express and the Times and on the one side, and then you end up with the Guardian and the Mirror, and then things even more to the left like the Morning Star on the other side. So you do get something of a balance there. So I don't particularly see that much of a problem within social media. In fact, I think social media, from my perspective, has been something of a boon with regard to these subjects. What is your criteria for no platforming is the last bit of this. That's a complicated one. My criteria for no platforming, it depends. If you're talking about universities, there's a difference between inviting a speaker, and I'm taking a broader definition of no platforming, not the original definition, which was the NUS in the United Kingdom. It was something that they came out with. To stem, really, it was mainly far-right groups and say that they would not share a platform with far-right groups, which was then extended to they would not allow student union bodies to give a platform to far-right groups. But we understand no platforming in a broader sense now. If it's course content, then I think it needs to be related to the course, and the academic levels come into play. If it's not course content, then I think we can have a slightly more open church to what's being talked about on campuses, etc., etc. With regard to no platforming, I quite like this idea. Tell me what you think about it, Distributist, in the UK, this right to debate idea, which is that if you have an idea that is deemed contentious, and for an idea, what constitutes a contentious idea? It's simply an idea that a significant number of people on the campus regard as contentious. That if an idea is regarded as sufficiently contentious, then a decision can be made not to no platform, not to say no, that means that person cannot speak on the campus, but what it says is that person cannot speak on the campus unopposed. So then you might have a system going back to those that proposed this speaker being an issue and say, right, can you put somebody to speak against them in a debate format? If they can, then you have a debate format. If they can't, then you'll say, okay, the speaker can still go ahead. You can't balk and block the speaker by simply refusing to provide a counter debater. No, what you will then have to do then is you can provide some questions that can be asked, right, at the end of this person's talk, so that you can challenge them through that medium of questioning at the end. I think that's quite a good way of handling it, and it provides a good balance between allowing things which are somewhat contentious and taking a more hardline approach. Right, so you're getting a balance. And so moving on to question 12, the final question, otherwise I think it's been quite by some margin the longest video I've ever made. For people who disagree with these progressive responses, why should they tolerate progressive cultural hegemony in cultural spaces? I think it probably depends what you're alluding to by progressive cultural hegemony. I mean, if by that you're suggesting that this is kind of being imposed by a minority on the majority, then I don't think you should, really. And I would suggest that you don't tolerate it to any extent. I mean, in terms of, it depends what you mean by tolerate. If you disagree with it, then you should speak up and say that you disagree with it. But if by cultural hegemony you mean that this progressive cultural hegemony, if it's reflecting the will of the majority of people and it's society reflecting how most people want society to function, then I don't really think that you can, what form is your intolerance going to take? If it's going to take the form of saying, well, fuck you, we're doing it anyway, then I think that's somewhat undemocratic, and I think you're running a very, very fine line there. I think these are things that need to be argued out, right? So you disagree with some of the progressive positions that you outline in your video very strongly. I'm sure you would disagree with some of mine, perhaps less strongly. You need to make your arguments, and those arguments need to function in alongside everybody else's arguments. I wouldn't say tolerate it to the point where you just put up with it. Argue your corner, make your defense. Absolutely do that. But tolerate it in terms of generally, unless there's very extreme circumstances, observing the rule of law and observing the standards that society seems to want, and trying to observe the fact that different people want to live their lives in different way, and trying to fit everybody around that without us treading on each other's toes to too great an extent. Okay, that concludes my answers. Now, Distributist, I know you had some problems with the people you'd spoken to. I'm sure you'll have a problem with what I've done here, in that you've had to listen to me for probably about an hour and a half, and I apologise for that. But I know that you said that the people you heard were given a progressive perspective, but weren't really outlining. They were very hazy about what their positions was. They weren't outlining what their goals or their positions were, some of the changes that we'd like to see made. They weren't justifying their positions. I hope that I have done that. Right now, maybe by doing that, I haven't given you the kind of radical progressive position that you would really like to go at. But there's no point spending your life tilting at what are quite extreme positions that not that many people hold. A disproportionate number of people online may hold. But if you're talking about progressive positions and progressive viewpoints, I suggest to you, it might not look like it on the net, but in real life, most people of a progressive persuasion are much, much closer to my position than some of the more extreme positions that you'd hear on the net. And so it's important that you engage with the kind of positions that I've made here. Okay, interested to see what I get back in response. For everybody else, thanks for listening. Really, if you've made it this far, tell me in your comment. I'll be interested to know. Okay, thanks for listening. Bye for now.